Today, I'm going to share with you 3 unassuming photos and the creepy backstory that follows them. However, of the 3 stories, only 2 of them are true, and the third one is written by yours truly. At the end of the third story, I'll reveal which one is true and which one is completely made up. I'll be changing the names of the true stories in case you may recognize them, but I will reveal the true identities at the end. If that sounds like something you would like, please subscribe, turn on all notifications, and hit the like button, and I'll keep making more. Let's begin. Story number 1. Misdiagnosis or truth. In this photo, you see a young woman who looks quite ill, being helped by another woman, perhaps in a hospital or receiving home care. However, that is only the start to the story of what happened during the time that this photo was taken. In the early 1970s, Carrie Michelle was just a regular teenage girl who grew up in Germany with a very religious family. But her life from 16 on would be something from a horror movie. At this age, she suffered her first seizure, and shortly after, she was diagnosed with depression. She had undergone several medical treatments from the psychiatric hospital, but as time progressed, her condition only seemed to get worse. The medications they were giving her didn't seem to work. Carrie even said she was hearing voices. This went on over the course of the next 5 years. Carrie said she believed she saw the devil, and the voices in her head were telling her she was damned and would rot in hell. She became increasingly frustrated at the lack of progress from the medications, and the depression grew worse. As more time went on, Carrie began showing signs of aggression, and even reports of her growling and being intolerant of religious objects. Her family then did what they believed was best. They contacted the Catholic Church and requested an exorcism, as they now strongly believe that Carrie was possessed. To perform an exorcism, you need permission from the bishop. So a priest went to Carrie to analyze her condition, and upon meeting her, immediately determined that she was not epileptic, but she was in fact possessed by a demon, and he urged the bishop to allow the exorcism to proceed. The bishop ended up allowing the exorcism to take place, but demanded it be kept a secret. On September of 1975, the first exorcism took place, but this was only the start of Carrie's torment and pain. Over the course of the next 10 months, Carrie was forced to endure 1 or 2 exorcisms per week, each lasting up to 4 hours each. Her family was now ignoring doctors' requests, relying solely on the Catholic Church. She was kept in a semi-private state during that time, only seeing the priest and her family. 67 exorcisms ended up being performed on Carrie. Both of her knees were broken from genuflection, an act of bending the knees from the exorcisms themselves. She was down to 68 pounds from malnutrition and contracted pneumonia. Sadly, Carrie died in 1976. Charges and a trial followed, with doctors claiming that this was a case of severe mental illness, potentially from an incredibly strict and religious upbringing and her epilepsy, and that her death was preventable a week up till when she had passed. Her parents were let off because they suffered enough, and the 2 priests were both given small fines, even though the initial charges against them were negligent homicide. To this day, people who know this story well still argue on whether this was a misidentified mental illness or if Carrie was indeed possessed by a demon. The picture shown is a picture of a severely dehydrated and starved Carrie Michelle. Story number 2. Horror in the classroom. Here you see a photo of Elias Sundin, dressed in what appears to be a Darth Vader mask, having a picture taken with a couple other students in a school hallway in Sweden. You can clearly see the sword in his right hand over top of his shoulder. However, what took place just before and after this photo takes this on a much darker turn. People who knew Sundin said he was a very private man, mostly keeping to himself and often dressing in all black, seemingly influenced by emo or rock and roll. He had no criminal record, but did make himself somewhat active on social media. He was found to have liked videos by different KKK leaders and seemed to have a strong dislike to immigrants in Sweden. When Sundin entered the school, he wasted no time in starting his attack. He knocked on different classroom doors, and based on who opened the door would depend on what he did. His first victim was named Lavin Eskander, a 20-year-old teaching assistant from Iraq. He was stabbed by Sundin and died on the scene. Sundin then stabbed a 15-year-old boy from Somalia in the stomach, who tragically would pass away later on in the hospital. Sundin would then wander the halls, with most of the school still being completely unaware of what had happened. In an unsettling moment, he posed with 2 other students, which is the photo being shown here. They believe that it was just a Halloween costume, given that this took place on October 22nd. There was even blood dripping from the sword, but they believed that it was fake and harmless. Shortly after, a 42-year-old teacher had asked Sundin to remove his mask, as some of the other students appeared to be frightened. This teacher, also a darker skin tone, was rushed by Sundin and also stabbed. He tragically died 6 weeks later in the hospital from his wounds. When police finally arrived, Sundin rushed both officers on scene, but he was shot and killed. He was just 21 years old at the time. The aftermath revealed that this was a racist-motivated attack. A letter that was found in Sundin's room also indicated that he did not expect to survive this spree, citing saying he wanted to be killed by cops. Based on Sundin's background and apparent difficulty in finding work, he blamed immigrants from stealing their jobs, and was cited saying, "Something has to be done about this." This was one of the most violent school massacres in Swedish history, with the Prime Minister traveling down to the town and calling this a black day for the country. Story number 3. A walk turned terrifying. When you look at this photo, what do you see? Likely a photo from maybe the 60s of a nice looking young woman standing in the bushes, perhaps near a sidewalk, a park, a golf course, or a hiking trail. The truth is, this is a photo of Janet Oxford, a high school student who had gone hiking with her boyfriend, Richard, back in the early 1960s. She looks happy to have her photo snapped by her then boyfriend, but what took place shortly after this photo was taken was a memory you wish you could forget. This photo was taken in the northern part of Ontario, an area that is deemed relatively safe by most locals, with sometimes sightings of moose or black bears on certain trails, but usually from a great distance. Regardless, precautions were always recommended. Janet and Richard were no exceptions to taking precautions. They were equipped with a bear whistle and had read numerous articles on what to do in case of an encounter with a bear. However, there was one animal, an animal that was extremely rare to come across, which they did not read up on. Shortly after this photo was taken, the two continued along the path. They were on their way back to their parking spot, which was actually located fairly close to a small town. What they were about to have an encounter with was something that they could never imagine. It was roughly a 5-minute walk until they would get to their car. When they turned a corner, maybe 400 meters from their vehicle, both were shocked with what was standing in front of them on the path, walking directly towards them. In front of Richard and Janet were 2 massive gray wolves. Richard and Janet both froze, but quickly had to decide that the best option was to slowly back up and sort of veer off the path. The 2 wolves didn't appear aggressive, but they clearly saw the couple. They were looking directly at them. Janet and Richard backed off to when they were now off the path, and maybe a bit into the bush, hoping that the 2 wolves would just continue to walk past them. When the wolves got to the part of the path that Richard and Janet were near, they both stopped. Janet said that she looked right at both of them. She could hear her heart beating out of her chest. Richard whispered not to move, but to not make eye contact either. Neither were sure if this was the proper course of action in a wolf encounter. Regardless, it didn't matter. Both wolves immediately darted from the path in the direction of Janet and Richard, their ears both pinned back, closing the small gap in almost no time. Before Janet could even react, she was knocked to the ground by Richard, and when she looked back up, she saw him standing in front of her. He reached for a stick, but the wolves were already on him. The impact knocked him to the ground, and Janet had to watch in horror as one wolf had him by the leg, shaking his head violently, while the other seemed to have him between his neck and his shoulder. All Janet could hear, aside from snarling, was Richard yelling for her to run. Janet, however, had no intention of leaving him. She got to her feet, found the biggest stick that she could find, and began swinging it as hard as she could at the wolf, mostly the one by Richard's neck. She missed several times due to the fast motion, and the wolf seemed to ignore Janet, but she finally made contact with the back of the wolf's neck. She heard a whimper, and the wolf let go and seemed to scamper further into the bush. She then turned her attention to the other wolf, the one by Richard's leg, who now had let go and was facing Janet, still holding the stick. She held it above her head and smashed it into the ground, attempting to scare the wolf off. Luckily, this worked, and the wolf rushed further off into the bush as well. She looked down at Richard and knew she had to get them out of here. For a wolf to attack a human, especially 2 solo wolves, they would have had to been desperate for food, and she believed that they would be back. She got Richard to his feet and helped him hobble along the path, constantly looking over her shoulder, hoping she wouldn't see them following. Luckily, she got back to their car, and as fast as possible drove them both to the nearest hospital, which was located about 25 minutes away. Sadly, however, Richard, he would not make it. It wasn't the bite to his neck that caused him to die, but his leg wound. The wolf had cut into Richard's femoral artery, which, if bad enough, can cause someone to pass away from blood loss in mere minutes. Richard lasted maybe 10, so Janet had no hope of saving his life. This was the first fatal wolf attack in the wild in Ontario history. Most experts believe that the wolves were castaways from their pack and extremely hungry. They believe that Janet posed too much of a threat and they left, not wanting to risk injury to themselves. Janet was deemed a hero, but she never fully recovered mentally from this incident. She knew that Richard had saved her life. That concludes our final story. Do you know which one was a fabrication? Is it story number 1, a family believing that their daughter was possessed, which in turn caused her death? Or story number 2, someone dressed in a Darth Vader mask attacking a school with a sword, Or story number 3, would two wolves really behave that way? Let's start with story number 1. The photo used in this photo is a picture of Anna Michael, who tragically died from malnutrition from 67 exorcisms. Yes, this story is sadly true. Depending on what you believe may depend on how you interpret this story, but many can agree that this was a torturous way for this young girl to live her final days. A popular movie was inspired by this story, called The Exorcism of Emily Rose. After this case happened, exorcisms in Germany greatly declined. Let's move on to story number 2. This photo is a photo of Anton Peterson, who, on October 22nd, walked into a Swedish school with a sword and murdered 2 teachers and 1 student. Yes, this story is completely true. That leaves story number 3. This picture is a picture of a childhood friend of mine from one of my parents, taken near a golf course. This photo was indeed taken in Northern Ontario, but the man who took this photo is alive and well today. This story is completely false. Thank you so much for listening. Please comment down below if you were able to guess the fake, or if you got it wrong. Also, please like and subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll know to keep making more. Thank you everyone, and enjoy your day.